Hands on the car. You don't belong here. Drop whatever's in your pockets, now.
Officer, this is my driveway. I am Marcus Sterling. I am a federal magistrate judge.
I don't care who you say you are. You fit the description. Turn around.
Officer Derek Vance had been wearing the badge of the Oak Creek Police Department for 6 years when he made the decision that would implode his career, humiliate his department, and cost the taxpayers of his city exactly $1.8 million. He was 29 years old, a man who carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the badge on his chest granted him immunity from consequence rather than the responsibility of service. He was aggressive, quick to judge, and possessed a dangerous certainty that his instincts were never wrong. It was a crisp, sun-drenched Saturday morning in October, the kind of day that homeowners in the affluent suburb of Oak Creek lived for. The leaves were turning amber and gold, the air was sharp and clean, and the neighborhood was quiet. But silence to Officer Vance often signaled that someone was getting away with something. He was patrolling Sector 4, a sprawling labyrinth of manicured lawns, 3-car garages, and winding driveways that housed the city's doctors, lawyers, and corporate executives. It was a low-crime area, the kind of beat where officers usually spent their time waving at joggers or checking on false burglar alarms. However, Vance didn't see himself as a community peacekeeper. He saw himself as a hunter. And that morning a dispatch call would give him a target. The call came in at 10:15 a.m. A resident reported a suspicious individual possibly stripping parts off a vehicle in a driveway on Willow Creek Lane. The dispatcher noted that the caller sounded anxious, claiming the man did not look like he lived there and appeared to be thuggish. Vance took the call immediately. His mind already primed by years of unchecked bias and a department culture that often looked the other way began to paint a picture before he even put his patrol car in drive. In his mind, he wasn't going to check on a homeowner. He was going to intercept a grand theft auto in progress. What Vance didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know because he never bothered to check the property records or pause for a moment of critical thinking, was that the man in the driveway was not a thief. He was federal magistrate Judge Marcus Sterling. Judge Sterling was 62 years old, a legal titan who had spent 35 years serving the United States justice system. He was a man who signed the warrants that officers like Vance needed to do their jobs. He was a man who had sent dangerous criminals to federal prison and had fiercely protected the civil liberties of the innocent. But on this particular Saturday, he wasn't wearing his judicial robes. He was wearing oil-stained coveralls, listening to jazz, and working on the engine of his 1967 Shelby GT500. And to Officer Derek Vance, that was enough to make him a criminal. Judge Marcus Sterling was a man of precise habits and formidable intellect. Born in the segregated South and raising himself up through sheer grit and brilliance, he had graduated top of his class from Harvard Law, before embarking on a career that was nothing short of legendary. Colleagues known him as the Hammer for his firm sentencing, but also as the Scale for his unwavering fairness. He was a man who demanded absolute respect in his courtroom not because of his ego, but because of the sanctity of the law he upheld. At 62, his hair was gray and close-cropped, his posture military straight even when relaxed. However, the man standing in the driveway of the expansive brick colonial house on Willow Creek Lane didn't look like a federal judge to the untrained eye. Sterling had been in love with American muscle cars since he was a teenager, and this Shelby GT500 was his pride and joy. He had spent the last 3 years painstakingly restoring it piece by piece. Today was carburetor day. His hands were coated in black grease. His vintage blue coveralls were smudged with oil. A rag hung from his back pocket, and a toolbox worth more than most people's cars lay open on the concrete. He was in his element, humming along to a Miles Davis track playing from a portable speaker on his workbench. For Sterling, these Saturday mornings were a sanctuary. They were the only time he could disconnect from the heavy burden of judgment, from the endless stream of motions and pleas, and focus on something tangible. Mechanics was honest work. If you fixed it right, it ran. If you didn't, it stalled. There was no ambiguity, no perjury, no gray area. He had lived in Oak Creek for 12 years. He was the first black resident on his block, a fact that had caused a ripple of whispers a decade ago, but had since settled into polite nods and neighborly waves mostly. He kept his grass cut to the millimeter, his hedges trimmed, and his property in pristine condition. He was the model neighbor. But the demographics of the neighborhood were shifting again, with new money moving in, bringing people who didn't know the history of the street or the credentials of the quiet man at the end of the cul-de-sac. Sterling wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist, leaving a faint streak of grease. He was focused on the fuel mixture screw, turning it with the precision of a surgeon. He didn't hear the siren because there wasn't one. Vance had arrived in stealth mode, rolling up the street quietly to catch the perpetrator in the act. Sterling was completely unaware that his peaceful Saturday was about to be shattered by a man who saw his skin color as probable cause and his tool as a weapon. The catalyst for this disaster was Brenda Miller, a 48-year-old woman who had moved into the house across the street just 3 weeks prior. Brenda was the type of person who spent her days monitoring the neighborhood app, reporting parked cars that hadn't moved in 24 hours and complaining about garbage bins left out too long. She prided herself on being the eyes and ears of the community, though her vision was severely distorted by deep-seated prejudices she would vehemently deny having. From her living room window, Brenda saw a black man in dirty clothes leaning into the hood of a classic car. She didn't see a neighbor. She didn't see a hobbyist. She saw a threat. In her mind, the owners of that large brick house were likely away on vacation, and this man was brazenly stripping the car for parts in broad daylight. It never occurred to her to walk over and say hello. It never occurred to her that a thief wouldn't bring a high-end rolling toolbox to a crime scene. She simply picked up the phone. 911, what is your emergency? Yes, I need police on Willow Creek Lane immediately, Brenda said, her voice trembling with manufactured fear. There's a man. A suspicious man. He's taking apart a car in the driveway of 420 Willow Creek. He doesn't belong here. Is he armed, ma'am? I don't know. He has tools. Large metal tools. He looks aggressive. I'm afraid to go outside. The dispatcher logged the call. Suspicious subject, possible auto theft in progress. Code 2. When the call flashed on Officer Derek Vance's computer, he smiled grimly. He had been looking for action all morning. Vance's personnel file was a minefield of red flags that the department had studiously ignored. In his 6 years on the force, he had accrued 6 formal complaints. 4 involved excessive force, and 2 involved discourteous conduct toward minorities. He had been sent to de-escalation training, twice a box-checking exercise he slept through. His sergeant, an old-school officer named Miller, no relation to Brenda, often covered for him, calling him proactive and a hard charger. Vance believed in the warrior cop mentality. He viewed every civilian as a potential combatant and every interaction as a battle for dominance. He didn't serve the community. He patrolled it like occupied territory. As he turned his cruiser onto Willow Creek Lane, he wasn't thinking about investigation. He was thinking about apprehension. He saw the black man. He saw the hood up. He saw the tools. Gotcha, he thought. He didn't run the license plate of the Shelby, which would have returned a registration to Marcus Sterling. He didn't check the address history. He simply pulled his cruiser diagonally across the end of the driveway, blocking the exit, and stepped out. Vance didn't adjust his hat or offer a greeting. He unsnapped the retention strap on his holster and rested his hand on the grip of his Glock 17. His adrenaline was already spiking, fueled by the narrative he had constructed in his head. He walked up the driveway with a heavy stomping gait, projecting authority, demanding submission. Judge Sterling heard the crunch of tires and the heavy footsteps. He pulled his head out from under the hood, a wrench still in his right hand. He squinted against the sun, seeing the silhouette of a police officer marching toward him. His first instinct was that something had happened in the neighborhood, a loose dog, perhaps, or a solicitation warning. He smiled politely, a natural reaction for a man who worked with law enforcement daily. "Good morning, officer," Sterling said, his voice deep and calm, the voice that had commanded federal courtrooms for decades. "Can I help you?" Vance didn't return the greeting. He stopped 15 feet away, legs spread in a tactical stance, his hand tight on his weapon. "Drop the weapon. Drop it now." Sterling looked at the wrench in his hand, then back at the officer. He didn't drop it immediately. The command was so absurd, it took a moment to process. "The wrench, officer, I'm fixing my carburetor." "I said, drop the weapon and step away from the vehicle. Do it now, or I will light you up." Vance screamed, his voice cracking with intensity. Sterling slowly placed the wrench on the radiator support and raised his empty hands, palms open. He knew the drill. He had seen the body cam footage in hundreds of cases. He knew that any sudden movement could be his death warrant, regardless of his status. "All right, the tool is down. Officer, my name is Marcus Sterling. I am the homeowner. I live here. This is my car." "I didn't ask for your life story," Vance barked, closing the distance but keeping his hand on his gun. "Turn around. Hands on the vehicle. Spread 'em." "Officer, you are making a mistake," Sterling said, his tone shifting from polite to authoritative. "I am a federal magistrate judge for the Eastern District. You are on private property without a warrant. I am identifying myself to you. If you check the registration of this vehicle, you will see it belongs to me." "Shut up," Vance yelled. "I'm not going to tell you again. You fit the description of a suspect reported for stripping vehicles. Turn around now." "A suspect?" Sterling's eyes narrowed. "I am wearing coveralls in my own driveway. Who reported this?" "That's none of your business. Turn around." "I will not turn around," Sterling said, standing his ground. He wasn't defiant. He was resolute. He knew the law better than Vance ever would. "I am under no obligation to submit to a search without reasonable suspicion of a crime. Working on a car in a driveway is not a crime. I have identified myself. My wallet is in my back pocket. I am going to reach for it slowly to show you my identification." "Don't you do it." Vance drew his weapon, pointing it directly at the chest of the man who had dined with the governor 2 weeks prior. "Hands in the air." The scene had frozen. The birds were still singing, the sun was still shining, but on the driveway the air was thick with the potential for violence. Neighbors had started to come out. A teenager 2 houses down was already filming with his iPhone. "Officer," Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming the voice of doom that defendants feared. "You are pointing a loaded firearm at a federal judge. You have no probable cause. You have no reasonable suspicion that survives scrutiny. If you pull that trigger, there is no qualified immunity that will save you. Lower your weapon." Vance hesitated. The man wasn't acting like a thief. Thieves ran. Thieves begged. They didn't lecture you on qualified immunity, but Vance was too deep in his own tunnel vision. To back down now would be to lose face. It would be admitting he was wrong, and Derek Vance did not admit he was wrong. He holstered his gun, but immediately pulled his taser. "That's it. You're under arrest for failure to obey and resisting an officer." Vance rushed forward. He grabbed Sterling's left arm, twisting it violently behind his back. Sterling winced. He had a rotator cuff injury from tennis, but he did not fight back. He knew that resisting was the catch-all charge officers used to justify brutality. He went limp, allowing Vance to manhandle him. "I am complying," Sterling said loudly for the benefit of the recording witnesses. "I am offering no resistance. You are hurting my shoulder." "Stop fighting," Vance shouted a lie for the benefit of his own body camera. He slammed Sterling against the fender of the pristine Shelby, the metal buckle of his belt scratching the custom paint job. He kicked Sterling's legs apart and ratcheted the handcuffs on tight, too tight. "You are under arrest," Vance panted, adrenaline coursing through him. "For what crime?" Sterling asked calmly, his face pressed against the warm metal of his car. "Trespassing. Loitering. resisting arrest, disorderly conduct. Vance rattled off the list like a menu. Trespassing at my own home. Sterling almost laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Officer, look at my back pocket. My wallet is there. My ID is there. My federal credentials are there. I'll check your ID when we get to the station, Vance sneered. He hauled Sterling upright, spinning him around. Right now, you're going for a ride. Sterling looked the young officer in the eye. He saw the arrogance, the fear masked as aggression, the total lack of professional discipline. Officer, I want you to remember this moment, Sterling said softly. I want you to remember that you refused to verify my identity when offered. I want you to remember that you are arresting me on my own property based solely on a phone call and your own bias. This is the end of your career. Yeah, tell it to the judge, Vance mocked, shoving Sterling toward the patrol car. I am the judge, Sterling replied. Vance ignored him, stuffing the 62-year-old man into the cramped back seat of the cruiser. As they pulled away, Sterling looked out the window and saw Brenda watching from behind her curtains. He saw the teenager filming. He closed his eyes and began to organize his thoughts. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a prosecutor building a case. The ride to the precinct took 15 minutes. It was the most expensive 15 minutes in the history of the Oak Creek Police Department, though no one knew it yet. Sterling sat awkwardly, his hands numb from the over-tightened cuffs, his shoulder throbbing. He didn't speak. He didn't ask for water. He didn't plead. He watched. He watched Vance driving one-handed texting on his personal phone, a violation of department policy. He watched Vance speeding 15 miles over the limit without lights or sirens, another violation. He listened as Vance called his partner on speakerphone. Yeah, just hooked a guy on Willow Creek, stripping a Shelby, claiming he lives there, claims he's a judge or some crap. Vance laughed, bragging. Old guy thought he could talk his way out of it. Did you check the VIN? His partner's voice crackled. Nah, didn't need to. Neighbor saw him taking it apart. Good enough for me. Sterling memorized every word. Failure to investigate. Admission of bias. Unprofessional conduct. The list was growing. Vance was digging his own grave with every mile that passed. Sterling felt a cold fury not just for himself, but for every young black man who had sat in this seat without a law degree to protect him. If this could happen to a federal magistrate in his own driveway, what chance did a teenager in a hoodie have? They arrived at the station. Vance pulled into the Sally Port, hauled Sterling out, and marched him into the booking area. The precinct was busy. Phones were ringing. Officers were typing reports. Vance walked Sterling up to the main desk where Desk Sergeant Thomas Miller, a veteran with 20 years on the job, was reviewing a file. Got a trespasser and auto theft suspect, Sarge, Vance announced proudly, pushing Sterling forward. Refused to ID, resisted arrest. Sergeant Miller didn't look up immediately. Trespasser where? Willow Creek Lane, rich neighborhood. Guy was stripping a classic car in the driveway. Miller looked up. He looked at the suspect. He saw the grease-stained coveralls. Then he looked at the face. The color drained from Sergeant Miller's face so fast it looked like he had suffered a cardiac event. He dropped his pen. His mouth opened, but no sound came out for a full 2 seconds. He stood up so quickly his chair knocked over backward with a loud crash. Officer Vance, Miller whispered, his voice trembling. What? What have you done? What he refused to. Unlock those cuffs. Miller roared a sound that silenced the entire room. Unlock them right now. Sarge, he's a suspect. That is Federal Magistrate Judge Marcus Sterling, Miller screamed, coming around the desk. He swears in our new recruits. He signs our search warrants. You just arrested a federal judge in his own damn driveway. Vance froze. The key in his hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He looked at the man in the coveralls. The man who had told him, "I am the judge." The man who was now looking at him with a gaze that could peel paint off a wall. I thought," Vance stammered. "You didn't think—" Miller shoved Vance aside and unlocked the cuffs himself. "Judge Sterling, Your Honor, I am so sorry. I don't know what I have no words." Sterling rubbed his wrists. There were deep red grooves where the metal had bitten into his skin. He didn't look at Miller. He looked directly at Derek Vance, whose arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the nausea of realization. "Sergeant Miller," Sterling said, his voice calm and icy, "I want photographs taken of these injuries immediately. I want this officer's body camera footage secured and uploaded to a server he cannot access. I want the dash cam footage. I want the 911 call recording. And I want the chief of police down here in 5 minutes." "Yes, Your Honor, right away." "And Officer Vance." Sterling stepped closer, smelling the fear on the young man. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." The fallout was swift, brutal, and public. Judge Sterling didn't just sue, he dismantled the department's practices piece by piece. The civil rights lawsuit filed the following week named Officer Derek Vance, the chief of police in the city of Oak Creek. It alleged unlawful arrest, excessive force, false imprisonment, and a violation of the 4th and 14th Amendments. But it was the discovery phase that truly damned them. The investigation revealed that Vance had a pattern of targeting minorities, a pattern his supervisors had documented but ignored. It revealed the 911 call from Brenda Miller, which was played on every national news network. The contrast between her hysterical description of a thug and the image of a 62-year-old judge fixing his car was a stark illustration of implicit bias. The video of the arrest went viral. The world watched as Vance screamed at a calm, compliant man. They watched as he mocked the judge's declaration of his identity. They watched the absolute failure of policing basics. The city's lawyers took one look at the evidence and begged to settle. There was no defense. No, you cannot defend arresting a man for standing in his own driveway. You cannot defend refusing to look at ID. You cannot defend the indefensible. The settlement was agreed upon $1.8 million. It was one of the largest payouts in the city's history for a single arrest. But Sterling didn't stop at the money. As part of the settlement, he demanded a complete overhaul of the department's training on bias and de-escalation. He required that an independent oversight committee be formed to review all citizen complaints, a committee that would have subpoena power. Derek Vance was fired 2 weeks after the incident. The termination letter was scathing, citing gross incompetence, bias, and a total lack of judgment. He was stripped of his certification, ensuring he could never work in law enforcement again. Brenda Miller, the neighbor, faced her own reckoning. While she wasn't charged criminally, she was sued for defamation and harassment. She moved out of the neighborhood 3 months later, unable to bear the shame of being the Karen who called the cops on a federal judge. 6 months later, Marcus Sterling stood in his driveway. The Shelby was finished. The engine purred with a deep, throaty rumble that shook the pavement. It was a beautiful sound. But as he wiped a smudge of dust from the fender, Sterling paused. He looked up the street. The leaves were green again. The neighborhood was quiet. But it didn't feel the same. It would never feel the same. He had won the lawsuit. He had changed the policy. He had held them accountable. But the peace was gone. Every time a patrol car drove by, his pulse would quicken just a fraction. Every time he worked in his yard, he felt the weight of invisible eyes watching, judging, assuming. He realized that the money didn't fix the humiliation. The firing of one officer didn't erase the system that created him. He was a federal magistrate, a man of immense power, and it had taken all of that power just to survive a Saturday morning in his own garage. Sterling turned off the engine. The silence returned to Willow Creek Lane. He looked at the camera lens of the world, at you, the viewer, and he wondered, if this is what justice looks like for a judge, what does it look like for everyone else? This story isn't just about a bad cop or a big settlement. It's about the fragility of freedom when bias holds the badge. What do you think? Should officers be personally liable for settlements in cases of obvious misconduct, or should the taxpayers continue to foot the bill? And how do we fix a system where a man is assumed guilty just because of where he stands and what he looks like? If you believe these stories need to be told, hit that like button and subscribe. We'll keep shining the light where it needs to be. Until next time, stay safe and know your rights.
Ma'am, last warning. Show me your ID or you're going in cuffs.
You have no reasonable suspicion. This stop is unlawful. I do not consent.
Don't lecture me. Turn around.
I'm asserting
Now.
my Fourth Amendment rights. That is not a
Hands
crime.
behind your back.
I am not resisting, and this...
The high-definition dashboard camera mounted on the dash of Patrol Unit 4 Alpha captured the entire sequence in vivid color. The timestamp in the upper right corner read 10:32 a.m. on a Tuesday. The sun was shining on the manicured lawns of the Brentwood subdivision, a quiet upscale neighborhood where the loudest noise was usually a leaf blower. Officer Kyle Miller had absolutely no idea that the woman he was staring at through his windshield, the woman standing at the end of a driveway in a cashmere cardigan, was not a porch pirate scouting for packages. She was Dr. Evelyn Vance, a tenured professor of constitutional law at the State University, a former appellate litigator, and the author of the very textbook on criminal procedure that was currently sitting in the trunk of Miller's own patrol car. She had spent 30 years teaching future prosecutors and defense attorneys how to interpret the Fourth Amendment. She had argued before the Circuit Court of Appeals, and now she was about to become the subject of a federal civil rights lawsuit that would bankrupt the city's insurance policy and obliterate Officer Miller's career before it had even truly begun. Before we unravel this infuriating and vindicating chain of events, I need you to do something important. Scroll down and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from today. Whether you're in Texas, New York, or outside the U.S., I want to know. And if you believe that nobody is above the law, especially those who enforce it, hit that subscribe button. This story is a masterclass in what happens when arrogance meets absolute legal competence. You do not want to miss the ending. Kyle Miller was 23 years old, fresh out of the academy, and eager to make his mark. He had been on solo patrol for less than 3 months. He was aggressive, proactive, and unfortunately prone to making snap judgments based on appearance rather than behavior. That Tuesday morning, there had been a bulletin about package thefts in the wider district, vague reports of a sedan following delivery trucks. Miller was cruising through Brentwood, a neighborhood that was predominantly white, scanning for anything out of place. When he turned onto Maplewood Drive, his eyes locked onto Evelyn Vance. Evelyn was 64 years old. She was standing at the curb next to her brick mailbox, sorting through a stack of envelopes she had just retrieved. She was wearing reading glasses, comfortable gardening slacks, and a beige cardigan. A black Lexus LS500 was parked in the driveway behind her. To any reasonable observer, she looked exactly like a homeowner checking her mail. To Officer Miller, she was a suspicious individual, lingering near a property that he decided she didn't look like she belonged to. He slowed his cruiser to a crawl, watching her. Evelyn looked up over the rim of her glasses, saw the police car, and went back to sorting her bills. She didn't run. She didn't look nervous. She didn't hide anything. Miller didn't like that. In his short experience, people respected the badge by looking anxious or acknowledging him. Her indifference felt like defiance. He pulled the cruiser to the curb, engaging his emergency lights, not because there was an emergency, but because he wanted to assert control. The blue and red lights reflected off Evelyn's reading glasses. She sighed a long, weary exhalation and waited. She knew the law better than he did, and she knew exactly what was about to happen. Miller stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his utility belt. He didn't have his gun drawn, but his hand hovered near his hip, a subtle intimidation tactic he had picked up from the senior officers. He walked up the driveway approach, invading her personal space immediately. "Morning," Miller said, his voice flat. "Do you live here, ma'am?" Evelyn lowered her stack of mail. She looked at him with the terrifying calmness of a woman who has cross-examined murderers and dismantled corporate legal teams. "Good morning, officer," she said, her diction crisp and precise. "I am retrieving my mail. Is there a reason you have activated your emergency lights and approached me?" Miller blinked. He wasn't used to suspects, and in his mind she was already a suspect answering a question with a question. "I asked if you live here," Miller repeated, stepping closer. "We've had reports of mail theft and porch pirates in the area. I need to see some identification to verify you belong at this address." The trap was set. Miller thought he was conducting a simple field interview. He didn't realize he had just stepped onto a legal landmine. Evelyn didn't reach for her purse. She didn't fumble for a license. She simply stood her ground, feet planted on the concrete of her own driveway. "Officer," Evelyn said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming authoritative, "you are currently detaining me on my private property. Under Delaware v. Prowse and Terry v. Ohio, you require reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime to detain me and demand identification. Standing at a mailbox is not a crime. Being a black woman in a suburban neighborhood is not a crime. So I will ask you again, what specific articulable facts do you have to support this detention?" Miller's face flushed. The legal jargon flew over his head, but the tone hit him square in the ego. He interpreted her precision as obstruction. He interpreted her knowledge as attitude. "Ma'am, you're not a lawyer, so don't try to lecture me on the law." Miller snapped the irony so thick it could choke a horse. "I am conducting an investigation. Your refusal to answer my questions is hindering that investigation. Now, for the last time, give me your ID, or you will be placed under arrest for failure to identify and obstruction of justice." Evelyn almost laughed, but she knew how dangerous this situation was. She knew that rookie officers often escalated to violence when their intellect was challenged. "Officer," she said, speaking slowly so his body camera would pick up every syllable. "Our state's failure to identify statute only requires a citizen to identify themselves if they have been lawfully arrested. You have not arrested me. You have no probable cause to arrest me. Therefore, I am under no legal obligation to provide you with physical identification. I am asking you to leave my property immediately." "That's it," Miller said. He stepped forward, closing the distance to less than 2 feet. "Turn around." "On what grounds?" Evelyn asked, not moving. "Disorderly conduct and resisting an officer." "I am not resisting. I am asserting my Fourth Amendment rights." "And asserting rights cannot be the basis for disorderly conduct. The Supreme Court was very clear on this in City of Houston v. Hill." The confrontation had drawn attention. Across the street, Mrs. Higgins, a 72-year-old retired librarian who had lived in Brentwood for 40 years, stepped out onto her porch. She knew Evelyn well. They exchanged Christmas cards. Seeing a police officer aggressively crowding her neighbor, Mrs. Higgins pulled out her smartphone. She wasn't tech-savvy, but she knew how to record video. She hit the red button and zoomed in. "Is everything okay, Evelyn?" Mrs. Higgins called out. "I'm fine, Martha." Evelyn replied, never taking her eyes off Miller. "This officer is struggling to understand the limits of his authority. Please keep recording." Miller looked over his shoulder. He saw the old woman recording. A smarter officer would have de-escalated. A smarter officer would have realized the optics were terrible. But Miller felt the corner he had painted himself into. If he walked away now, he felt he would look weak. He would look like he let a belligerent woman talk him down. He chose the path of most resistance. "Ma'am, put your hands behind your back," Miller shouted, reaching for her wrist. "I am not resisting," Evelyn stated clearly for the camera. "I am complying under duress. I am not consenting to this search or seizure." Miller grabbed her left wrist and twisted it behind her back with unnecessary force. Evelyn flinched, a sharp pain shooting through her shoulder, but she remained stoic. She didn't pull away. She allowed him to cuff her. The cold steel ratcheted tight against her skin. Miller spun her around and pushed her toward the patrol car. "You want to play lawyer?" Miller muttered in her ear as he marched her down her own driveway. "You can tell it to the judge." "Oh, I intend to," Evelyn said softly. "I intend to tell it to a federal judge." "And I suspect that judge will be very interested to hear why you arrested a constitutional law professor for checking her mail." Miller paused for a microsecond as he opened the back door of the cruiser. The words, "constitutional law professor," filtered through his adrenaline, but he dismissed them. She was bluffing. She had to be. He shoved her into the back seat. The hard plastic was unforgiving. Evelyn sat awkwardly, her hands cuffed behind her, watching her house disappear from view as Miller slammed the door. He got into the driver's seat, breathing hard. He felt a rush of triumph. He had won the encounter. He picked up his radio. "Dispatch Unit 4 Alpha, 1 in custody, female uncooperative, transporting to station for booking." He put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. The ride to the precinct took 15 minutes. Miller tried to make small talk, perhaps realizing he had been too rough, trying to normalize the situation. "If you had just shown me your ID, none of this would have happened," he said, looking at her in the rearview mirror. Evelyn stared out the window at the passing trees. She didn't look at him. "Officer," she said, her voice ice cold, "I am invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. I suggest you do the same, as everything you are saying is currently being recorded and will be used to establish your qualified immunity defense is invalid." Miller scoffed and turned up the radio. He had no idea that he was driving a ticking time bomb into his own station. When they arrived at the precinct, Miller pulled Evelyn out of the car. Her cardigan was ruffled and her wrists were red, but she walked with her head high. He guided her through the sally port and into the processing area. The smell of stale coffee and floor wax filled the air. Sitting at the booking desk was Sergeant Thomas Kowalski. Kowalski was 58, a 30-year veteran who was counting the days to retirement. He had seen everything. He looked up over his spectacles as Miller paraded his prisoner to the counter. Kowalski frowned. He saw a well-dressed black woman in her 60s, handcuffed, looking not like a criminal, but like the school principal who used to terrify him as a child. "What do we have here, Miller?" Kowalski asked, his voice gravelly. "Disorderly conduct, failure to identify resisting," Miller recited, puffing his chest out. "She refused to show ID during a suspicious person stop, started shouting legal nonsense at me." Evelyn stood perfectly still. "I did not shout," she corrected calmly. "And I would like my handcuffs removed, Sergeant." Kowalski looked at Evelyn, then at Miller. He sighed and opened the booking software. "All right, let's get your property logged," Kowalski said. "Miller, uncuff one hand so she can sign." Miller hesitated, then undid one cuff. Evelyn rubbed her wrist. She reached into her pocket with her free hand and placed her items on the counter, a set of house keys on a leather fob, a slim iPhone, and a leather wallet. Kowalski picked up the wallet. "I need to verify ID for the booking," he muttered. He opened the wallet. The first thing he saw was a driver's license. Dr. Evelyn Marie Vance. Address, Ortomo 2 Maplewood Drive, the same street Miller had picked her up on. Kowalski paused. The name sounded familiar. He flipped the flap of the wallet. Behind the license was a university identification card, Evelyn Vance, J.D., Chair of Constitutional Law, and behind that was a laminated card with a holographic seal, Department of Justice, Senior Legal Consultant. Kowalski's blood ran cold. He knew exactly who she was now. She was the woman who came in twice a year to give seminars to the command staff about updates in search and seizure law. She was the woman whose picture was on the back of the Criminal Procedure for Law Enforcement textbook that was sitting on Kowalski's own bookshelf. Kowalski slowly closed the wallet. He looked up at Miller, who was busy filling out a form, oblivious to the atmosphere in the room shifting from routine to catastrophic. "Miller," Kowalski said, his voice very quiet. "Do you have any idea who this woman is? Some lady who wouldn't show me her ID." Miller shrugged. Kowalski closed his eyes for a moment, praying for patience. "Miller, this is Dr. Evelyn Vance. She wrote the book on the Fourth Amendment. Literally. She trains the FBI on probable cause." Miller stopped writing. The pen hovered over the paper. He looked at Evelyn. She offered him a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I tried to tell you, officer," Evelyn said, "but you were more interested in my submission than my rights." Kowalski stood up immediately. "Take those cuffs off her, now." "But Sarge, take them off," Kowalski barked, slamming his hand on the desk. The sound echoed through the booking room, silencing the other officers. Miller fumbled for his key. He unlocked the other cuff. Evelyn rubbed her wrists where deep red indentations were already forming. "I'm going to get the lieutenant," Kowalski said to Evelyn, his tone apologetic and deferential. "Dr. Vance, please have a seat. I am very sorry about this." "Don't apologize, Sergeant," Evelyn said, checking her watch. "Just ensure the body camera footage is preserved. I want the unedited file. And I want the dash cam footage. And I want the initial call log that sent this officer to my street." Kowalski disappeared into the back offices. Miller stood there, suddenly feeling very small. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. You really teach law?" Miller stammered. Evelyn looked at him not with anger, but with profound disappointment. "I teach the Constitution, Officer Miller, the document you swore an oath to uphold. Today you treated it like a suggestion. And that is why you will never wear that badge again." Lieutenant Grady burst into the room 2 minutes later, looking like he had just swallowed a lemon. He had been briefed by Kowalski. He knew the department was staring down the barrel of a public relations nuclear explosion. "Dr. Vance," Grady said, extending a hand. "I am Lieutenant Grady. There seems to have been a massive misunderstanding. You are free to go, of course. We can drive you back to your home immediately." "I will not be getting back in a police car, Lieutenant," Evelyn said, declining his hand. "My husband is on his way. He is also an attorney. While I wait, I would like the name and badge number of this officer, and I want a copy of the incident report before I leave." "We haven't finished the report yet," Grady said, trying to do damage control. "And frankly, since you're being released without charges, we can just treat this as a consensual contact that went wrong." "Lieutenant," Evelyn cut him off, her voice sharp, "do not insult my intelligence. This was a custodial arrest. I was handcuffed, placed in a vehicle, and transported against my will. That is a Fourth Amendment seizure. If you destroy any record of this, I will add spoliation of evidence to my complaint. Do I make myself clear?" Grady paled. "Crystal clear, ma'am." Evelyn Vance walked out of the police station 40 minutes later. She didn't look back at Miller, who was sitting in the corner with his head in his hands, being verbally dressed down by 2 supervisors. She went home, showered, and sat down at her mahogany desk. She didn't cry. She worked. She drafted a preservation letter for the evidence. She contacted the most aggressive civil rights litigator in the state, a former student of hers. 3 days later, the federal lawsuit was filed, Vance versus Miller and the city of Springfield. The complaint was a work of art. It didn't just allege misconduct. It dissected Miller's actions frame by frame, citing the specific Supreme Court precedents he had violated with timestamps from the video. The dashboard camera footage was released to the media the same day the lawsuit was filed. It led the evening news. "Constitutional law professor arrested for checking mail." The headline was irresistible. The video was damning. The world watched as Officer Miller, arrogant and aggressive, bullied a calm, older woman on her own driveway. They watched him twist the arm of a grandmother. They listened to his condescending, "Don't lecture me" comment. The internet did what the internet does. Within hours, Miller's face was everywhere. Legal experts went on CNN and Fox News to break down the stop. They all agreed it was a textbook unlawful arrest. There was no reasonable suspicion. There was no crime. It was racial profiling wrapped in incompetence. The internal affairs investigation was not the usual slow walk. The city manager, the mayor, and the police chief had all seen the video. They knew they couldn't defend it. Officer Kyle Miller was placed on unpaid suspension pending termination. During his disciplinary hearing, his union representative tried to argue that he was inexperienced and following training on proactive policing. The review board didn't buy it. The chief of police looked at Miller and asked one question. If she had been a white woman in a gardening hat, would you have stopped her? Miller couldn't answer. He was terminated for cause, gross misconduct, violation of civil rights, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The city didn't even try to go to trial. They settled with Dr. Vance for $1.2 million. It was one of the fastest settlements in the city's history. They wanted the story to go away. But Evelyn Vance wasn't interested in a quiet payday. She used the money to start the Vance Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to providing top-tier legal representation for indigent defendants who had been victims of pretextual stops. She turned her trauma into a shield for others. As for Kyle Miller, the consequences followed him long after he turned in his badge. His termination for a civil rights violation meant he was Brady-listed, placed on a prosecutor's list of dishonest or unreliable officers. No other police department would hire him. He tried to get a job in private security, but a simple Google search of his name brought up the video of him arresting Dr. Vance. He was radioactive. The last anyone heard, he was working at a logistics warehouse in another state, driving a forklift. He had wanted to be a hero. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a video clip shown in police academies under the module What Not to Do. Evelyn returned to her classroom the next semester. The lecture hall was packed. Students sat on the stairs just to hear her speak. She walked to the podium, adjusted her glasses, and opened her laptop. She projected the video of her own arrest onto the massive screen behind her. The room went silent as they watched their professor being handcuffed. When the video ended, Evelyn looked out at the sea of future lawyers. The Fourth Amendment. She began, her voice steady and powerful, is not a theoretical concept. It is a physical barrier between the power of the state and the liberty of the citizen. And as you can see, that barrier is only as strong as the people willing to enforce it. Never forget that authority without accountability is tyranny. The lesson of that day wasn't just about the law. It was about dignity. It was about the fact that even when you do everything right, even when you are an expert, the system can still come for you. But it also showed that when you know your rights and have the courage to stand firm, you can push back. What is your biggest takeaway from this story? Do you think the settlement was enough, or should Officer Miller have faced criminal charges for assault? Let me know in the comments below. If this story moved you, please share it. Education is our best defense against abuse of power. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice served. Until next time, stay safe and know your rights.